Okay, so we're coming to the final session of today's workshop, and in this session, I want to have a look a bit at the notion of data sharing, what it means to share. Can we close the door? Are there still people outside? Thank you. Yeah, so I want to have a brief look again at what it means to share and what to consider when you consider sharing. And then in the second part of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about what archives do in their everyday life and what kinds of services archives offer and what you can actually do to get your data into an archive. So we already, throughout the workshop, once and again, I think we used the word open data or open science, and at the same time we discussed, especially in the last session, we discussed possible limitations to sharing your data. So if your data contains information that might put your participants at risk, for example, it's quite obvious that we can't easily share it. So rather than thinking about open data versus just closed data, it makes sense to think of data sharing as a spectrum. And what you can see is that on one end of the spectrum we have closed data. So closed data is data that is not accessible to anyone except the primary researcher, or that is only accessible to a very limited number of people under very strict conditions. Then on the other end of the spectrum you have open data, and open data in this sense would be data that is accessible to anyone without any restrictions. So typically this would be statistical government data that you can download for free from a website where there's no user registration or anything. So the data is just there for you to download. And it's quite obvious that this isn't possible for most social science data or data from other disciplines that work with human research participants. And that's where the area of shared data becomes interesting. So shared data is data that can be accessed by others. It can be accessed by third parties, but access is tied to certain conditions. And basically these conditions are what can be specified in the licenses that Sebastian talked about in the last session. And if we look at the licenses, even shared data is a spectrum. So we can have licenses that are more restrictive, licenses that say, before anyone is allowed to use this data, please get in touch with the producer of the data, or the data can only be used if you sign a specific contract where you assure that you are going to treat the data absolutely confidentially, etc. So as you can see, this is the data is accessible, but we have some barriers for accessing the data. And the main reason to do so is to protect the participants of your research. And then in the field of shared data, we may have also licenses that are a bit less restrictive. Creative Commons licenses might be an example for this. This is a license. Sorry, did you mention them? No. Creative Commons, you often see that on the internet for either images or for text publications. It's a small logo. Wait, I'm just going to show them. Ach so, ja, ist egal.
These are all of our slides. So the first slide you can see in the bottom line of CC license.
Nah. Yeah, so you may have seen these little logos before, and they specify for a text or for a data set, they specify what you as the author allow others to do with the data set or the publication. And this is a form of a license that is not very restrictive. So basically, when this kind of license is on a work, for example, that's the license we use on our slides. It means everyone can use them for any purpose, but they have to give credit to us as the authors. And there are other modules to these licenses that say, you can use my data, for example, you have to give credit to me, and you can't use it for commercial purposes, for example. So this is a way of making data or other digital objects accessible to others, but you can specify certain conditions under which you do that. And so data will fall probably on, data can fall anywhere on any point in the spectrum. And when you think of research data management, it is important at the beginning of your research project to think about where on the spectrum you think your data is going to end up. If you think about this and realize the information that I'm going to collect is too sensitive and it's going to put my participants at risk, what's going to happen most likely is the data is going to end up here, and that's okay. But if you want to open up the data more broadly, it is important to know that you're going to do that at the beginning of the research, because as Sebastian said, this will have an impact on, for example, how you formulate your the informed consent. So for sensitive data where you know that this data is not ever going to be shared, it's okay to put in the consent form a phrase saying, I assure you that this data is not going to be shared ever with anyone. So it's not going to be used within the project, full stop. But if you have that phrase in your informed consent form, but you really wanted your data to be somewhere there on the spectrum, then your data is going to be lost for that purpose because you can't share it. So when you start thinking about the data that you were going to collect and where you want it to be on the spectrum, really do that very early on. So you can take measures to enable your data really to be shared as openly as possible. Okay, so this illustration looked at data sharing from the perspective of when the project has ended. So this is mostly about the end product of your research. Your project is done, and then you send your data out there into this sphere to fall somewhere on that spectrum. But when you think of the research process before the project has ended, there too you have to think about which kind of information is shared with whom at which point in the research. And because this also has implications for data management. And there is another model that could be helpful in doing that, and it's called a domain model. And the idea of that domain model is to simply distinguish different phases or areas of your research where different types of data are shared with different people. Sorry, that sounds terribly abstract, but I'm going to illustrate this a little. So the first domain that becomes relevant in a research project is called the private research domain. And that is basically the domain where the primary research team works and where you conduct your actual research. So it's where you plan your research, where you collect your data, and then prepare the data for analysis and analyze the data. So when you think about who has access to data in this phase and in this domain, the answer is probably everyone in the primary research team, even though there may be distinctions that, for example, a student who's just supporting may not have access to all the files. But generally in the primary research group, probably all of the information, all of the data is shared with everyone in that tight primary group. So in the private research domain, pretty much everything is shared. Yeah. Then the next domain is called the shared research domain. And that is the domain where some of the project results are shared with researchers that are not, who are not part of the primary research team. And the situation might be, for example, that you have completed part of your project and you want a peer, for example, to double check your results or to comment on the results of your research. Or another situation would be the project has already ended, you have not shared the data, but someone wants to replicate your findings and you give them access to the data. So here we have a situation where not only the primary research team has access, but also selected people from outside of the research team. And in this case, if you look at the question, what is shared? Obviously, the answer is not everything is shared, but what you share, for example, are only probably fairly stable versions of the research, of the data, or maybe even only final versions of the data. You would not share all of your working files. You would not share the raw data. So here, the amount of what is actually shared is a lot smaller than in this domain. Then there are two more domains. They're called the publication domain and the persistent domain. And both of this is basically, these domains become relevant when the project has ended. So once the project has ended, and if the project team has decided to share the data, to make it accessible, then it goes into the publication domain. And in the publication domain, what you have is basically final versions of your data. This is basically the end product that you share, and that usually is not going to change very much unless you have a longitudinal project where updates are being made. But overall, in the publication domain, there's only the final version. There's the documentation for that final version, but this is not going to change anymore. And linked to the publication domain may be the persistent domain. And the persistent domain is basically the domain where archiving takes place. And the two domains, they belong together, although they don't necessarily overlap completely. So it is thinkable that I share something, I publish it because I upload it into a repository, but that repository does not have the task to preserve this data for the long term. So maybe after 3 or 4 or 5 years, the data is going to be deleted from the repository, or you decide to take it down. So publication is not necessarily long-term persistence and long-term publication, although ideally that would be the case. At the same time, not everything that goes into the persistent domain has to be published. Again, if you think about a situation where you have data that is very sensitive and it can't be published, there is probably still, there's still a good reason to save that data and to preserve it for the future. First of all, it is, as part of your research practice, it's important to do so for the case of replication and replicability of your research, but it's also possible that it's really, really interesting data that can't be shared at this point, but maybe in 80 or 100 years when the participants are no longer alive. That's a very dark example. I shouldn't be using that. Yeah, but I mean, we discussed this in the connection with embargo periods. If the embargo period is long enough, at some point, maybe later, it could still be published. But ideally, the publication domain and the persistent domain overlap. So if you look at this, I'm sorry, I hope it's not too abstract. It's very, the idea behind is that the amount of information that is shared actually gets smaller. So here is where the bulk of the project work takes place, and this is where the bulk of the information is. But not all of this is obviously intended for reuse by third parties or by people who are not part of the project. Because what should be shared ultimately here are the final versions, and this is what you put out there for others to reuse. So the amount of information that is shared gets smaller, and the amount of people that you share with gets bigger, basically. What I have indicated here with those arrows is that whenever information is transferred from one domain to the next, typically you would have to add more information to it or metadata. So in the primary research team, you will probably know what your data is about, you know what you have done with the data, how you handled it. But if you don't write that down, it'll be forgotten. So as soon as you send the data in the next domain, where it may be reused, for example, by others, you will have to add a bit more information. You have to write that down, because otherwise those people in that domain won't be able to understand your data. And the same is true if you then transfer the data in the publication or persistent domain. Because in this domain, the situation that you have is the primary researchers are most likely still accessible. So if someone has a question about the data, they can address the primary researchers and clarify that. But in the publication domain and the persistent domain, that may not necessarily be the case. So in that domain, this domain is really where you have to have the most context information, the most metadata, because ideally the data should be understandable by others without having to ask the primary researchers anything. Okay, so one point I'm trying to make with this is that when you do your research data management planning, try to think about which of the information that you collect here needs to travel into the other domains. Because, as I said in the beginning, you will not share everything that is collected here, not everything that is produced over the course of the primary research project is going to be kept. So you are going to delete and discard certain files and information, measurements that went wrong, or analysis that didn't work out. So you don't have to send all of that to an archive. So when you plan your research, try to think about which information is going to travel how far in this through these domains, because that helps you to decide which kind of measures you take in terms of data management. Because again, if you have a whole number of or a certain amount of data that you produce here that you know is never going to leave this domain, there are certain things that you simply don't have to do. Or if it is data that you know is going to be deleted at the end of the project, then you don't have to think about the question, is the file format I'm using still readable in 5 or 10 years? So by thinking about how the information is going to be shared and for how long it is going to be kept, this just helps you to plan your data management a bit better. Yeah.
I'd like to make a comment.
Yeah.
I think that from point of view of financer, there is some controversy, or I don't know how to say it. Because if we are talking about the research data, it will be hopefully made available later, so we do not talk about final versions. In a lot of cases, valuable are the raw research data, provided good methodology and so on, but interpreted data, they are quite useless actually as a primary source of information.
I agree. What I meant with maybe stable versions is a better point, but basically when data comes here, it has been analyzed once by the primary research project. So
why that cannot be primary raw data without analyzing? Just as why the methodology, how it has been collected, how it has been done, so the data can be differently interpreted.
Yeah, there
might be
I agree.
What will be some details, what can be followed separately as in this methodology.
That's true, but still the data would somehow have to be finished. So the measurement has to be finished. So if I think of not social sciences, but of a lab test, I run this lab test, and anything that comes out of this lab test as raw data, I publish, but the measurement is not going to change anymore. That's what I was trying to say. So if I run a survey, after I have run the survey, I have an amount of data, and if I decide not to process this data anymore, it's still, I mean, it could still be published, but how do I
try to give an example when you think about big international surveys, which are mostly not produced for primary researchers, but for secondary use only, like the European Social Survey and stuff like this. What you have within these research groups that produce the data and harmonize them, clean them up before they are published, is in general you have to beat off all the interviews. And you will take some of the information out of the beta, like the gender, the age and stuff like this, and add it to the questionnaire, just simply to show by whom respondents have been interviewed. But you will not take the whole beta and publish it. So the data are produced for reuse only, but there is a step in between collecting the data and publishing the data, where you clean them up and where you think about how to harmonize things and so on.
Well, yes and no. I think that it's possible when we what my idea was what I did look, it's more general than social sciences. So if experiment has been done, so if there will be some restrictions, they cannot be public anyway. Yeah. But with this part, what is not restricted by any restriction can be and should be public.
I totally agree with you. I think it's a question of how we understand final versions, and I think that's what has to be. This is what needs to be defined by the person who publishes the data. Basically, I think with the terminology final, I was just trying to indicate that. It has to have the data has to have some sort of format that is. The experiment has to have been concluded, for example, or maybe one step of the experiment. It has to be somehow a unit. I think that's what I was trying to say. It doesn't necessarily have to be entirely heavily processed data. I totally agree. It could be raw data if that is possible. But it shouldn't be once it's published. So if we think back to the idea in the publication domain, for example, this is where DOIs, for example, would become relevant, and you give a DOI to something that is not. If it has a DOI, we can't change it anymore. If I have a new version of it, I have to give it another DOI. So I think that's that's what I was trying to express with the notion of final. It doesn't mean it can't change, but it has to be a certain, a step in the work that is somehow concluded and has a fixed output, which doesn't mean we can't add other outputs. Okay. Okay. Then, okay, I'll finish with the bit on data sharing. I think we emphasized this probably often enough now that we would really like to see as much data as possible to go in the publication in the persistent domain, but ultimately it really depends on the data if that is possible. So you always have to balance the desire to share data and the need, or the need to share data with, for example, the rights of your participants, but also, of course, no one asks you to share your data before you, as the primary researcher, have finished working with them. So you conclude your project and you publish your results, and then others can maybe get a chance to work with your data. But this is not about taking your data away from you the moment you have collected them. I think that's also important to point out. Okay, are there any further questions about this? I'm sorry if it was maybe a bit too, that's the archive person in me that likes to think in domains and okay, so then in the following, I'm basically going to focus on the publication and the persistent domain, and we'll talk about what archives do. And if you think of the research process again, archives come or start playing a role very late in the research process. So a project finishes and wants to share its data. And we have already discussed, I think, a little bit about the problems that may arise if data sharing and archiving comes as an afterthought. So you finish the problem, and then you start thinking about, oh, I think I should share my data. This is most likely going to become a problem. So in an ideal world, when you start planning your research, you should already start thinking about, am I going to share my data? Am I going to archive it? And who might be interested in taking it? I'm going to repeat that a couple of times. But first of all, I want to advertise all the great things that data archives do. So one thing that data archives do for you is that we keep data safe, and we do that on different levels. So an archive or a repository in a university, for example, provides backup and secure storage. So we have backup procedures that make sure that the data is not lost even if a hard drive or a server fails, for example. Secure storage would also mean that we can control very tightly who can have access to certain data and who can't. So we have routines for that. Another way of keeping data safe is by way of what we call digital preservation or long-term preservation. And basically what that means is that we try to guarantee that the data that we have can be used now and in the future. And that would mean, for example, if the data, for example, is in a file format that I know is going to become obsolete because the software is no longer going to exist, then what we do as an archive is we take all of the files that we have in that format and transform them. So we migrate them, that's what we call it, into a new file format. So this is something that we do in order to make sure that data can be used even if the software that it was created with, for example, does no longer exist. Then the final aspect of keeping data safe would be to provide legal and ethical security. So for data producers, that means that we can try to make, or we take measures to make sure that their rights are respected. We take care of the licensing for data producers. So anyone, as Sebastian showed, anyone who downloads data from our catalog, well, it didn't show that, but if you want to download data from our catalog, you have to sign a user agreement that specifies what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. And this has, if a user violates these terms, then we have a way of actually taking legal steps against them. And for us as an archive, this may be a bit easier as for an individual researcher, for example. The other aspect that focuses more on participants in research is that we try to also keep the participants of the research safe. And Sebastian mentioned the possibility, for example, of a secure data center. But this also means that if we receive data for archiving, one of our curators is going to sit down and going to look at the data to check for anonymization problems, for example. And if we find that the data is not sufficiently anonymized, we'll return it to the data producer and we'll ask them to fix that problem. So this is one way in which we try to protect the participants in research. On the other hand, we keep data safe, but we also make it accessible. So we try to send it out into the world and get it used. And that, again, happens on different levels. We have a more technical level where we try to offer data and information in accessible formats. So this might be file formats that are very widely used in the community. And for us, as a social science data archive in the quantitative social sciences, that means that we offer data in SPSS and in Stata. And that, yeah, but not all of it.
Not all of them.
Yeah.
We will now transfer data sets to ASCII because it's really stable. But it has, of course, other problems like the labeling.
Yeah. So, and yeah, there's also always going to be a distinction between the format that we give to researchers for reuse and the format that we use to preserve the data for the long term, because ASCII is just a text format, and that's of course awesome because all of the information is easily accessible, but for researchers it's not very convenient to work in ASCII with ASCII files. But yeah, as an archive, we really try to think about which file formats, data formats are helpful to allow the data to be reused. Persistent identification. Oh, no, sorry, the metadata. I mean, we already talked about metadata, how they can help data to be found and retrieved. And in the break, I think we briefly discussed how one problem at the moment is that data is spread out all over the world. It's held at smaller individual institutions, but it's really difficult if you look for data. And if you're trying to find data to reuse in your research, it's really difficult to actually find data, even if it's out there. And this is why, for example, in CESTA, we have the CESTA catalog, and this is going to be developed further so that at least for the European data archives, it is possible to get a quick overview or a quick idea of whether usable data is in any of these archives. And yeah, the one big tool that we need for that is metadata. Then accessibility comes with persistent identification. That could be a DOI number, for example. Some countries also use another form of persistent identifier. It's called a URN. But basically the idea is you assign a number, an identifier to a data set, and that identifier is not going to change. and it links the data set with a minimum set of metadata. So if you have this identifier, you can always reach the data, and you can always find more information about the data. And of course, the persistent identifiers also help in making the data citable. So if someone reuses the data, they can cite the data and the original author using the DOI number or another persistent identifier. And then accessibility for us also has an aspect that has to do with understandability. Something is only accessible if I can understand the information. And for that purpose, when we ingest data into our archive, we check the kind of documentation that there is, and we also enhance that documentation. So when we archive something, we really want to make sure that there is enough context information for the data to be actually reused. And yeah, this is also something that we do to make data accessible. Okay. Yeah, and finally, it's something we like to emphasize, that we offer support basically on all of the topics that we have discussed in this workshop today. And we really want to encourage researchers not to be hesitant about getting in touch with an archive. Normally, archives, I would say, they'll be really happy to help you, even if it's totally early on in your research, and you maybe don't have a very clear idea of what kind of data you will have and what you're going to do with it. But if you consult with an archive very early on, you really increase the chance that the data that you collect and the way you document it can be taken up by the archive without you putting a lot of extra work into this. So if you know from the beginning what the archive is interested in and what requirements they have, it's easy for you throughout the project to fulfill these requirements. And as an archive, yeah, it's especially anonymization and data protection. I mean, these are really tricky areas that can make archiving and sharing data very difficult. So if you have any questions about how to solve a certain problem there, we really want to encourage you to discuss this with an archive that is is a discipline, probably a disciplinary archive in your research field, but I would think that even the subject specialist in your library might be a good starting point, because they can refer you to other points of contact if necessary. Okay, so now I have talked about how we would really love for you to talk to us very early on in your research process. And this is going to be my lead over to the question of how do you actually get data into an archive. And indeed, the first step would be you have to find an archive that is suitable. So it has to be an archive that is, for example, relevant to your discipline. That's one version. So if you're doing research in the social sciences, you would look for a social science archive. But it's perfectly possible to look for archives using other criteria. So some archives, for example, focus on certain data types or formats. So you have sound archives, for example, or image archives. So if you produce sounds or images, and these kinds of archives might be interesting for you. Sometimes archives, like national archives, for example, they serve a certain region, like a country. In the UK, you have a situation that if your research is funded by the
National funding agencies.
yes, there are just one or two. by the what are they called? Not Research Council UK, but in the UK, if your research is funded by one of the national funding agencies, there is automatically a requirement to submit data to the UK Data Archive. So in some cases, in some countries, you don't even have to look for an archive, but your funder is going to tell you where the data is going to be submitted. And of course, for you, if you're looking for an archive and there are several options for you, it's possible also to decide based on what kind of services the archive offers or what their reputation is. And the search tool that Sebastian already mentioned, it's re3data.org. That's a growing database of archives and repositories worldwide. And you can search by discipline, also by the access categories, how open or closed the data is. And I mean, this is helpful when you look for data to reuse, but it's also helpful if you want to see in your field which archives exist. Okay, once you have identified an archive, you contact them, and yeah, but it's I sometimes have the impression that researchers are hesitant to do that, especially, I mean, maybe our archive, GESIS Data Archive, it's a very big archive, and GESIS is a fairly big organization. I always have the impression that researchers think, yeah, but I only have this small project, and I don't want to bother them with this. This is the kind of feedback we sometimes get, and there's no need to be hesitant about this. So just have a look at the web page of the archive and contact them, because one question that you can clarify very early on is, would the archive be interested in taking your data? Because for us, for example, we have a collection policy that defines the kind of data that we take, and if a research project contacts us and tells us, okay, we're doing research in this or that field, and the data that we expect to produce is this or that, then we can already tell them, yeah, that would be very interesting for us, or the other option is we think that we are not the best archive for this data, but we tell them, put them in touch with another archive. So this is a resource that's out there for researchers to tap into, and they totally should do that. Then once you have decided which archive you will submit the data to, clarify with them how they want the data, in which form, when the data should be submitted, what the submission channel is going to be, and try also to clarify this fairly early on, because like that you don't have any surprises as your research proceeds. And at this point, it can also be good to talk about the legal and ethical issues that we already discussed. Because ideally, the archive, for example, can give advice on how to formulate the informed consent, for example, before you collect the data, to make sure that the data can be archived. So all of this, these are areas that archives can give advice on. Then you conduct your research, and then at some point, before you submit the data, or as you submit the data, the archive is going to ask you to sign a deposit agreement. It's sometimes called an archival contract. There are many different words for this, and basically what this contract does is it specifies the rights and obligations of the archive, and also the obligations of the data depositor and data producer. So for example, the data depositors are asked to confirm that the material that they're giving to the archive does not somehow infringe the rights of third parties, so there's no copyright infringement, etc. At the same time, for digital preservation, the archive has to have the permission to copy the data, so I have to be allowed to make different copies of different, for backup, but also to distribute the data to data users, and all of this because the data depositors is the rights holder, or is allowed to sign this contract on behalf of the rights holder. We ask you to give us permission to do all these things because digital preservation can also, for example, involve, as I described, that the data is going to be transformed and it's going to be transferred into a different file format. And this is something you also have to give us permission to do. So all of this is going to be covered in the deposit agreement. And it basically clarifies, as I said, it clarifies the obligations and rights of the data depositor and of the archive. Yeah, then once this agreement has been signed, the final step, ideally without any extra work because you managed your data perfectly and nothing went wrong. So once the project has finished, you simply submit the data to the archive, and there are different ways of doing that. So during the exercise, I just told the story that last year we received a submission from a professor who was retiring, and his submission consisted of 1 or 2 big boxes of magnetic tape. And he did not discuss that with us beforehand, so that was a slight complication. So that normally we don't get data on magnetic tape. It's very common to have an upload form where the depositor fills out some metadata fields and then simply attaches the data and uploads it. Sometimes we often receive data by email as well, and if the data is sensitive, then of course you have to find different ways, because email too is not necessarily the best way to do that. And there are secure file sharing services. We use CryptShare, for example, where the information that is transmitted is encrypted. Yeah, and ideally, these are 5 simple steps that shouldn't be, they shouldn't take up too much time and be too much effort. Because if you, as we keep mentioning, if you start thinking about this early, hopefully the obstacles that you're going to encounter are not very high. So if this becomes something that happens as you do your research, the extra amount of work that you need to put in to actually get the data into the archive shouldn't be too high. And that's why I asked the example that you gave in the introductory session, I think, of someone who said they had to put in 40 hours of work to actually publish the data. I'd be interested in knowing if that was with data management and with the intention of publishing the data from the beginning on, or if that was one of those situations where someone realized the project is done and, oh, I want to publish the data, so what do I have to do now? So that was my final point. I think I have a conclusive slide. This is our mantra. Start thinking about this early. Contact us early. And if there's only one thing that you, or maybe 2 things that you do early on, try to make sure that your informed consent forms are not formulated in an overly restrictive way, because you get that situation all the time that someone wants to give us data or we can't accept it. And that's really a pity, because then that person took work into preparing the data for archiving, and that work was pointless because they can't actually share the data. Yeah. So that was my very quick run through the work of preservation. And yeah, do you have questions about this?
I guess we haven't covered what happens when we don't do those things. Essentially.
Okay.
Foster won't finance a workshop for you anymore. No, I mean, if you share data, it really depends upon you. And it's not to say that good data management is the only way to share data. But good data management really simplifies data sharing, and it really simplifies your life or your research project. So it's simply because of you keep track of what you're doing and why you do things. It's not only to ensure that you will not lose your data, but it's also to ensure that you care about all these legal and ethical compliances, and that you care about documentation and all these stuff. So I think most of the things we were talking about today are things researchers in general do in the research project without really thinking about it. And the idea of research data management, and especially of this research data management plan, is really that you document or systematically document what you have done, which really helps you to find things once you're searching for different files, and helps you to explain why you did things as you did it. We once had a request in our archive, or indeed a Chester training, where a project comes up to us and said that we lost all our documentation. What can we do? It's a really nice question, because what should we do? I mean, we do not even know the project, but they thought about we might have an idea how to recover documentation. And indeed, that's not true. What they might have done is having a good backup strategy, thinking about their folder structures in advance, so not to accidentally clean up their documentation, and all these things. And this is simply what good research data management can protect you from. So, yeah. I don't think no one will punish you due to bad research data management as long as it is not required by your funders or your institute. I mean, if you do not follow up the guidelines of your employee, what could happen? Search a new job, or never get funded again. Any other questions? I think most of the questions will come up once you really have to work with it, and once you're faced with different problems and challenges. And the one thing I'd like to say in this context is that don't hesitate to get in contact with an archive. Don't hesitate to get in contact with us. So you got the contact information, or you might simply find us by Googling Chester Training.
Did you check that actually works?
Chester Training actually does, yeah.
There was a time when we weren't easily found.
No, I mean on the Chester website you can find us,
Yeah,
and the contact
links are
information.
also on the slides.
What we did today, we tried to give you an initial idea about what research data management is. We tried to focus on the most important topics and talk about the most important aspects of research data management. Of course, this one-day workshop could only be an introduction, providing a relatively quick or short overview of research data management. We hope you somehow get familiar with this data management plan, and once again remember that it uniquely relates to research projects, so there are no two identical research data management plans. They always have to be adapted according to the research project. We touched only some of the sections of the data management plan, so there are a lot of sections in there we didn't talk about, like for long-term preservation and data sharing is something we didn't touch, or talking about responsibilities and resources for data management. At the beginning of a research project, this plan is really helpful because it tells you about what you have to think about for the research project. And at the beginning, it's no longer than a page or 2 pages, and it's more like a to-do list. I'll have to care about this and this and this and this. But when you frequently update your research data management plan, it really becomes a good documentation of what you did, and it helps you to understand your research project also in 10 years. Yeah, this is what I mentioned already, that you should remember it's a dynamic thing, the research data management plan, that you have to adopt it and frequently update it. If you do not have any further questions, the good news is I have only one slide left. The bad news is it tends to be, or it looks like, a complex one, also it isn't. What you want to increase your awareness for is that your research data management should be adequate in regard to your research project. And you might think about research data management as a continuum running from a minimal documentation of your research project to an overall or all-embarrassing documentation what has been done. And on this slide, we simply tried to split up this continuum into 3 steps. The first step is just simply a basic quality assurance, which means that you only want to use the data within the research project. You're not willing to share your data with anyone else, and you're even not willing to keep your data for replication. This is really worse. No one will do this, okay? But at that moment, what you need is, of course, you need a minimal documentation. You have to think about the file formats you will use in the project. You, of course, need informed consent when you collect data, at least to use them within the project. You have to think about a backup strategy as long as the project runs. So just simply ensure that your data are understandable within the project, but only within the project, and are stored safely and securely in the project. What you should do, at least, the minimal criteria, is keep your data for replicability. And this is something where I cannot say that, or cannot give an advice for how long you should keep your data. Normally, it's that you should keep your data for at least 10 years. In terms of, researchers might come up to you and say that I don't believe in your results. Can you show me that you didn't make any mistakes in your research project? If you'd like to keep your data, or if you plan to keep your data internally, not sharing, for at least 10 years, you of course have to think about that the file format you use should still be usable in 10 years. It has to be a part of your informed consent. It is not to tell your participants data will be destroyed at the end of the project, but data will be kept internally for additional 10 years. And likewise, you have to think about a backup strategy that works for 10 years. You have to think about that the documentation you might need is a bit more than if it's just simply for the research project itself, because in 5 or 10 years, you will not understand everything and remember everything you remember today. And last but not least, and this is where all the projects will go, of course, is to enable the reusability of your data, so to share your data with others. And in this regard, of course, you have to take or care much more about your documentation to enable other researchers to understand what you did. You, of course, have to care more about the file formats you use to enable others to access your data. You need informed consent to share your data. You have to think about anonymization and all these stuff. So once again, it tends to be complex, but indeed it is not. You should simply think about from the very first beginning, what am I going to do with my data beyond the project? You should keep them, at least for applicability, but the best thing you can do, of course, is to share them with others.
And basically what you can also do is match these 3 columns with the domains I mentioned at the beginning of my session. So the basic quality assurance is basically what would happen in the so-called private research domain. Replicability would already be in the shared research domain, and then you have the reusability would be in the publication and persistent domain. So maybe that helps to make it a bit less abstract.
Any questions about this slide? Once again, we will send around, or Lillian will send around all the slides. We simply have to give her the latest versions because we made some changes in the last few days. And otherwise, I'd like to say thank you for your participation in this workshop. Thank you for your attention, for the discussions you had, the results you presented here. We always appreciate participation, and you were a great group. Thanks a lot.